Well, good morning, and thank you everyone for joining the webinar this morning. My name is Tyler Leach. We're going to be going over IT and cyber due diligence and our 2025 insights that private equity firms and portfolio companies should be considering. First, I want to introduce who we are and who your presenters are today. My name again is Tyler Leach. I'm a director here in the Transaction Advisory Services practice. I lead our IT and cyber due diligence service line. And alongside me is my co-worker and co-presenter here. I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Tyler. My name is Andrea Tomczak, and I am a manager also in our Transaction Advisory Services practice based out of the Chicago office. And just like Tyler had mentioned, we are excited to be here with you guys today. I am going to quickly cover our agenda. So we've got a handful of learning objectives that we're going to go over. We'll also be giving an overview of what IT and cyber diligence is. Next, we'll review the key considerations around both AI and cybersecurity that we would like you guys to be thinking about in 2025. We'll also touch on the importance of investing in IT and cyber projects. And lastly, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. But if questions come up throughout the presentation, feel free to throw those in the chat, and we'll work to address those throughout the related section. So with that, let's take a look at the learning objectives that we're planning to cover during today's session. So by the end of the session, we hope you'll be able to identify what IT and cyber due diligence is, and why it's important to consider during both buy and sell side transactions. We're also going to discuss some key considerations in 2025 around AI and cybersecurity that companies are facing in the IT and cyber landscape. And then lastly, recognize why companies should invest in IT and cyber project recommendations during the hold period. So let's jump into it here. So we're going to kick some things off this morning with a polling question. So first and foremost, I want to understand how many acquisitions in 2024 did you perform IT and cyber due diligence on? So we've got A, less than 10, B, 10 to 15 transactions, C, 16 to 20 transactions, or D, 20 plus. And I will say our client base is really all over the board here, doing anywhere from 5 to 50 plus with add-on considerations. Tyler, would you agree with that?
Yeah, Andrea, and with platform considerations as well. So we may see a variety of responses here, but this will give us a good gauge of how many people on the webinar here are considering this as a part of the M&A lifecycle with the diligence piece here.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what our results look like. I know in prior high transaction years, like 2021, this poll might look a little bit different. All right, I see the numbers coming through. So we've got about 84% that have done less than 10 acquisitions involving IT and cyber due diligence.
Yep, and then Andrea, I think we're seeing kind of across the board here, the majority of that is less than 10, but we do have some doing 20 plus on this. So again, we see a variety here, but it's good to know kind of where a temperature check of everybody is here on the call before we begin.
Awesome. Now that we've got a feel for who's in our virtual room, we did want to touch on what IT and cyber diligence is, since we do or may have some folks on the phone who aren't familiar with it and are learning about the process during this morning's session. So what do? We support acquisitive buyers and sellers who are looking for support with both pre-close IT and cyber due diligence for mergers, acquisitions, investments, and sell-side transactions. So during the process of IT and cyber diligence, we really are evaluating a company's IT and cybersecurity posture through the whole M&A lifecycle. So we're looking to identify risks, identify vulnerabilities, threats, and weaknesses for our clients. And we've outlined, you can see on this slide here, these are our standard scope areas that we'll typically cover and assess during diligence. So starting off with IT governance, this is really where we'll get an idea of whether a company has an IT strategy, a budget in place. We'll look at like how their organization's set up. Is it an internal team that they've got in-house, or do they hire an external MSP to support the business? We'll also look at IT spend here. So some of the projects that we've worked on don't have details into certain IT investments that were made, and they're not tracking IT spend very granularly. So we would like to evaluate that during the IT governance portion. And then from an application perspective, we're really looking at the key applications that make the business run. Is there any customization in place? We're looking at key software risks here. Is their licensing up to date? Teller and I have seen situations where licensing wasn't up to date. So our clients would have to absorb some of those licensing costs post-transaction. So maybe they would factor it into the purchase price or negotiation process if it's a significant cost amount. And then also just one other note on application software, proprietary development. So there is some higher risk around that. So we'd want to look at that in this section too.
Yeah, Andrea, to your point about the proprietary development, that's another key evaluation area that we look at here, because again, we have seen situations where some of that proprietary code has been not specifically owned by that company, that it was owned by third parties. So there are potential risks here that you'll want to consider when you're, again, looking at that area.
Yeah, great call out, Taylor. And in the IT security scope section, so we're really looking at system monitoring here and what's in place to protect the overall IT environment from security threats. And we'll talk about those security threats later on in the presentation, but really trying to see if they've got the proper tools in place to mitigate those risks. And then on the infrastructure and operation side, in this section, we're really taking a closer look at the hardware that's in use. So where are the servers hosted? Are they locally hosted? Are they in the cloud? We'll look at that in this section. And then lastly, data privacy and HIPAA, those go hand in hand together, but we're really looking to see how the data is stored, how it's transmitted, how it's protected and encrypted in an organization. So if a company is in the healthcare space and handles any sort of patient data, we would be evaluating that the proper protection and procedures are in place for that patient data.
Okay.
And we did want to touch on and quickly highlight some of the recent industries that we've served across our team. So construction, government contracting, financial services, healthcare and life sciences, manufacturing and distribution, professional services, retail and e-commerce, and then software and technology. Now, these are pulled from some of the recent projects and industries that we serve, but we really are industry agnostic, and IT and cyber procedures are relative across all industries.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrea, and that's what we want to point out is these considerations used to be initially applied really to just regulated industries because of the types of data, but because of the threat landscape now, you'll see that this is now evolving even into non-regulated industries as well, based on the types of information and the types of attacks that are being presented that organizations are facing. So a great point, and just wanted to make sure we called that out.
Absolutely. Tyler, I'm actually going to pass it back to you to talk us through some of the AI considerations to keep in mind for 2025.
Yep, thanks, Andrea. And to Andrea's point, we do want to focus in really and zoom in here on the key considerations for 2025. And I'll talk through the first being AI, which again is a very hot topic. And again, we will discuss cybersecurity, which seems to be at times we think, okay, we've heard enough about cybersecurity, but as you'll see, this is not going away. And with the combination of AI is only going to present further challenges and risks that organizations are going to face. So as we move on here to the next slide, I think we need to start just for everybody on the call, just to give a general basis of when we say artificial intelligence, what do we mean by that? So firstly, just a brief definition, we're referring to technology that's capable of performing functions that normally are associated with human intelligence, such as reasoning, learning, and self-improvement. And we wanted to pull out 4 areas here specifically to talk through what some of those solutions may look like and what they are and how they're integrated, certainly with businesses today. The first one being machine learning. So what is machine learning at a high level and at a whole? So machine learning is a subfield of artificial intelligence where AI systems are taking data, historical data, analyzing that data, and then by doing that, it's enabling these systems to be able to identify patterns and make predictions based on what that data sets are and make suggestions on that. So one very practical example that you'll see pretty much used in your everyday lives here is take, for instance, your Netflix or one of your streaming solutions. They make content recommendations. So what's happening there is these AI systems are taking your past watch history or shows that you scrolled over, and as you watch more shows, it gives you recommendations. So that's a very simple example of how machine learning solutions like that are being leveraged and utilized in businesses. Another example is from a sales standpoint. Websites are based on your purchase history, making suggestions of items you may like or want to consider based on past history or past purchases. So again, this is a very simple example of how this technology is being leveraged and utilized in real case examples. Natural language processing. So again, this is using machine learning as well with this, and deep learning and other techniques. But basically what natural language processing is are different types of tools where the technology is able to understand human language that is being spoken to it, and then take that language, digest that language, and then provide a response back. A practical use case here, again, is around specific chatbots. So as you go to websites, you'll see chatbots that pop up that you're able to type in a question to, and that chatbot will be able to respond back to you based on the technology and the system of understanding human language. Another specific use case of this is with your AI assistants that you see from whether it be Amazon Alexa or Siri with Apple devices, where you're able to dictate, it's able to understand and then respond back to you. So again, we see these tools being leveraged and utilized more and more with systems. Predictive analytics is another type of AI solution where it's using machine learning, statistical modeling to be able to take historical data, analyze that data, see trends and analysis, do a trend analysis on that data, and provide recommendations based on what those data sets are. Again, what this allows businesses to do is to be able to understand potential sales volume or demand during certain times based on again, what the solution is able to analyze in a large data set and provide analysis on. Robotics is another type of AI technology that's, again, beginning to evolve more and more that we're seeing specifically around robotics process automation that's been in place a few years, where you can have software robots that are performing automated tasks that usually required a lot of manual human intervention that they're able to do from a software perspective. But you also have a huge advancement in technology such as self-automated or self-driving cars, where there's companies that are promoting taxis now that were able to drive themselves and pick you up and take you to a destination. So again, with artificial intelligence, these are just some very, very few examples of how that's being used and what we mean when we're saying artificial intelligence. So what are the benefits of being able to use this for companies? So increased speed and productivity. You're able to do things faster and more productive because these types of technologies and solutions are always able to be constantly engaged. They don't wear out like we do as humans. They're constantly working and can constantly being able to serve and help you from a business perspective. They're able to take large amounts of data and generate cognitive insights very quickly so that you can understand things faster, whereas before there was a lot of manual analysis that had to occur. So they're able to do that very fast for you and effective. So what are some of the use cases that also are helpful here? From a predictive analytics standpoint, one of the examples is fraud detection. again, that's being leveraged and utilized by a lot of banks now. They're able to take large transaction volume to be able to analyze, again, your historical spending patterns and your history, and then be able to identify anomalies outside of that and notify you effectively. So as a whole, as we kind of zoom out here, this technology is not going away. It's only getting integrated further into businesses. And as you, as a company, are considering what types of solutions you could potentially integrate, or what types of companies that you're going to potentially purchase, you do need to think through the implications of what is being used, and from a risk management standpoint, further, what we'll talk about you can do to make sure you're mitigating those risks appropriately during the diligence period or during your hold period when you think about the implementation of some of these technologies. So for polling question 2 here, we do want to get a sense, because we're going to further talk about a very much newer type of AI that's kind of revolutionizing the industry, multiple industries now, which is generative AI. So what percentage of organizations at this point do you believe have already made an investment into generative AI?
Tyler, while they're answering this polling question, I'm curious, have you taken one of those rides with the no driver, the automated rides?
I have not yet, and I'm a little nervous with still trying to work out some of these bugs that they're working out. But there are a lot of specific markets right now that they're testing these out in, and that they're finding a lot of effective use of this technology. I don't think we're far out from having this widespread within a shortened time period.
I just got a video of a friend of mine who was just taking one in San Francisco this morning, so
yep.
Very timely.
Okay, so here we have the breakdown. So 33%, look, no, 15% seems to be the majority here. And then let's see, we've got, 33 and 37 coming in very shortly. So let me, as we move to the next slide, you'll understand why we're doing this polling question now. So this is Infotech's Future of IT survey here in 2025 that they've run and done across multiple organizations. And what you'll see here is that 37% have actually already made an investment into generative AI. So let me step back for a second and explain what the difference is in some of the AI solutions that we previously just mentioned and what generative AI is. So the difference between some of the solutions we talked about earlier, the main difference is those solutions are using historical and current data to then make insights based on that data. What generative AI has brought with ChatGPT specifically in 2022 being launched is that now with generative AI, we can take that data and create new data from that. So new images, new text. Generative AI is really revolutionary in that sense, whereas previously we're analyzing and making sense of large data amounts and doing some forecasting on this. This is able to generate new content, which is one of the main differentiators at a very high level. So you can see that as you're thinking about potentially making an investment in here, if you're a company or if you're acquiring a company, this type of technology and solution is not going to be going away, but rather you need to start thinking about the considerations you should be taking to understand the technology, consider how you could implement, or again, if you're purchasing a company, what are the risks with this type of solution, and how is this solution being utilized by the company that you're thinking about acquiring? Again, just to point out, that's around 71% that by the end of 2025 will have made some type of investment or adopted AI or generative AI in that sense. You can see that on this slide that there's still about 13% that won't no investment with this, and some for good reasons and good causes. However, 87% are going to eventually make some type of investment here based on the data of that survey. So what are some of the main key considerations that you need to be thinking about if you're, again, going to implement this technology, or if you're buying a company that's already implemented, what are some risks that you need to think about? One of the big risks that you need to potentially think about is algorithmic bias. So because these systems and the AI systems are training on data sets, those data sets potentially could be biased data that have existing societal biases in that data that they're training on. So what that can eventually result in is potentially some poor decisions being made from a business standpoint, and negatively impacting your customers or society at large based on what those decisions are. A very practical example here was in 2018 when Amazon was implementing their AI recruiting tool, which ultimately ended up favoring male applicants on the resumes that they were sorting through versus female applicants because of the data sets that it were trained on, with a predominant pool being majority of male resumes that the data sets were trained on. So again, they ended up abandoning that because they realized that the decision making on that tool couldn't be gender neutral with how they were recruiting and how they were favoring resumes, which ultimately could lead to unfair hiring practices. So again, just a specific example of making sure that when you're looking at this, that there's not algorithmic bias in the algorithms of the solutions that you're utilizing and leveraging. Another thing, there's a lack of trust and adoption because a lot of times companies aren't able to explain and demonstrate how certain conclusions are being reached. One of the main things here is if you're doing diligence on a company here and they're leveraging this technology, they do need to be able to explain how that system, from a transparency and accountability standpoint, is reaching the conclusions with the output that it's generating. Again, this is a big risk, and this is why some companies don't want to adopt it, because they can't fully sometimes explain that. So that is something that we'll cover a little bit later that you need to be thinking through. The inaccurate data models and data that's put in there, again, we'll cover on these risks, but you do really need to make sure when you're looking at what the solution's using, making sure that this data is complete, that it is accurate, that it is considering a full range of populations there, to make sure that the output here is not going to have that bias in there. One of the other challenges is cybersecurity that can be compromised based on this. So there are the potentials for vulnerabilities and weaknesses depending on the type of technology that's being used and how it's being developed. So making sure in your environment that you're taking the appropriate risk considerations and the appropriate controls to have in place there as you develop that technology, or if a company has, what those are, and to make sure that there's not potential vulnerabilities that exist. Again, as we mentioned, AI can generate inaccurate or harmful content, which could result in your customer trust or negative publicity. Again, that goes back to the beginning in making sure that whatever the data sets that the system is being trained on, that you're doing the proper risk and considering the proper risk and doing the proper evaluation around that. One of the other things that we're seeing is that for companies, a lot of companies are using the AI data that's being generated from generative AI to present or publish research, but they're not fully vetting that data. So if that is being used by employees, you need to make sure that there's proper awareness and training in place, because again, we say that it's a good starting point for what generative AI is able to do to be able to create new content and new data, but you do need to check the sources from which it's pulling that data and where it's created that content to make sure that there aren't potential issues from an accuracy standpoint or from a potential copyright issue as well. With that, there's also challenges right now, and there's a lot of discussion on the type of data that is going into these language models, because again, as these language models train on data that is being input into them, they could result potentially in a violation of privacy laws and regulations, and have regulatory fines associated to them based on what information is being put in. and who's responsible. Again, this is personally identifiable information specifically we're calling out here because of the risk of what's going in there and understanding what security and privacy controls have been put in place to ensure the protection of that data. And lastly, regulatory fines that can result because of privacy and laws and regulations that have been violated. So from a governance standpoint, what should you be doing and how should you be thinking about it if you're going to implement a type of technology like this? Or if you're acquiring a company, what should you see from a governance standpoint in place as you're evaluating this company to make sure that they are handling the technology correctly? So first, we won't go into all the frameworks and principles on this call, but you need to make sure that these proper frameworks have been vetted and reviewed to enable compliance with the applicable laws, to make sure that these types of laws and regulations are being adhered to. You need to review these, again, as we have below, to make sure based on your business and your industry that you have considered all of the applicable laws and regulations. You need to make sure that AI usage has self-defined ethical standards in place as well. And you need to make sure that you're balancing the governance of this solution as a whole with the proper risk management and safeguards to make sure there aren't any unintended consequences. Again, to the point in 2018 with Amazon's recruiting tool, sometimes these types of implications are not malicious by intent, but can be without the proper vetting and the proper considerations being taken to make sure you don't have an unfavorable outcome like they experienced. From a policies perspective, what does that practically mean? You need to have internal policies that define clear roles and responsibilities for an AI initiative. Again, if you're doing diligence on a company, you need to ensure that they have something outlined and in place. You need to make sure that there's the proper ethical guidelines in place and the proper principles that are taking into the AI development process and the considerations around, again, algorithmic bias to make sure that there's not going to be any potential unfavorable outcome from the output that's being generated. Transparency, accountability, and bias mitigation are some most important considerations for AI governance. Transparency and accountability specifically on you need to understand how the technology is being used, what the data output is, and be able to explain that. If a company can't fully explain that to you, that should be a red flag that you need to ask further questions because there's potential risk there that they don't understand how the technology is generating the output that it's given and how they're using it in their everyday business. From an oversight perspective, you need to make sure, again, this can be large or small in scale, depending on the size of the company you are or the size of the company you're acquiring, but you need to make sure there's the proper committees in place here to oversee AI projects and compliance, to make sure that there, again, as we've just previously mentioned multiple times, that there are considerations taken for privacy laws and regulatory compliance. Make sure that there's regular audits being done over the technology and continuous monitoring of the processes to assess the status and the state of the technology. And lastly, one of the biggest ones here is the oversight of third-party AI systems. So again, if you are contracting with an AI vendor, you need to make sure as a part of the due diligence process now, understand in the contractual clauses what data is going to reside with them. If you decide to leave, are they going to delete that data? We've seen a lot of situations where these vendors, as they're growing, especially some of the startups, do not want to delete the data for sometimes good reasons because they want to continue to allow the language model to train on that data to enhance and improve that. However, depending on the type of data that's being held by them, you need to consider the implications of the potential of de-identification of that data and that's outlined in contractual clauses for who and who is not responsible for the security protections around that. So again, the vendor due diligence, vendor third-party risk management is huge if AI is at place and being utilized. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. We're gonna move into some cybersecurity considerations here. So I'd like to first just take a look at a few statistics around data breaches and cyber attacks over the recent years. So you guys can see here that the cost of a data breach is just continuing to increase, and unfortunately, these costs are not getting any cheaper. So to mitigate some of these risks, it needs to really be looked at in a twofold approach. So a well-built infrastructure and the controls that support that in place, and then also having well-trained personnel. If you don't have well-trained personnel, human error really becomes one of the main risks here, which really brings me to a recommendation on our end that companies can be doing, and that's cybersecurity awareness training. Might be annoying to sit through those trainings. Trust me, Tyler and I can relate, but it is a preventative control that really does help identify future attacks when you have those coming into your inbox, the phishing trainings, and you can see them and be able to identify them and report them to your company. That you can have the best built infrastructure, but if someone puts on you just want $100 Amazon gift card phishing email that comes through and it contains a malicious link, then it can be all over from that one email. So just want to bring awareness to that. So companies really need both a strong infrastructure and well-trained personnel to maintain that robust cybersecurity posture. And we'll flip over to the next slide here. So we've included a snapshot of the FBI's IC3, which stands for the Crime Complaint Center report. So you'll notice that the data is from 2023. That's the latest data available, but the next report is due to be released any day now. It should be uploaded to their website soon, hopefully sometime this month. But this report helps the FBI really identify and track and respond to cyber attacks and cyber threats effectively. So we often are reviewing it just to keep top of mind. You can see that in 2023, the IC3 received more than 880,000 complaints of fraud, totaling close to $12.5 billion in losses. So if you take a look at the complaints and losses, you'll see that they're both continuing to just rise here. And then since 2020, there's also been a pretty significant uptick in complaints, but the losses are just continuing to increase more and more significantly compared to the complaints. So we'll flip to the next slide where we are going to highlight actually a specific type of cybercrime that we're seeing more and more, and that's ransomware. So you can see here, I've outlined on the right-hand side that the FBI received a total of 2,825 complaints of ransomware, with losses equaling more than $59.6 million in 2023. And for those of you who are not too familiar with ransomware, I'm just going to quickly touch on what it is. So it's a malicious software that locks down your files on your computer and demands a ransom to be paid to unlock those files. So very disruptive. Having an incident response plan and business continuity plan, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in detail, is crucial if you are hit with ransomware at your company. But you can see the right-hand side, so it's not just one sector that's really being targeted by ransomware. In regulated sectors like healthcare, it's definitely a more frequently targeted area just due to the sensitive data that they hold. So in the deal space, I mean, we've seen multiple instances of ransomware attacks that have been happening in the last year, but it's very much happening to our clients. It's happening to their targets, and I'm sure many of you on this call even. So Tyler, with that, do you want to just touch on another common cybercrime that's happening in this space with emails?
Yeah, and still this is one of the known attacks that threat actors are using, is really around business email compromise. So again, just to point out, and again, pulling from the 2023 data, I don't think this is going to show up in 2024 again, because we continue to see this being an effective method. Is again around 21,489 complaints the Internet Crime and Complaint Center by the FBI received on business email compromise specifically, with again adjusted losses nearly 2.9 billion. For just a quick summary of what business email compromised is. Again, these are email accounts that threat actors are using that may look like a potential vendor of yours or a potential client of yours. They're spoofing sometimes a lot of these emails, so it may be at a very simple example, instead of tyler.leach at us.forvismazars.com, it may be tyler.leach, but spelled with two E's instead of an A. So again, it looks they're still trying to make it look like that it's from a potential vendor on that, with the idea of potentially getting funds from you. A lot of times we see this with wanting to change potential ACH payments if they're a customer or if they're a vendor that needs to be paid, or a wire that needs to occur based on a transaction that needs to happen. But again, it continues to be, unfortunately, effective mechanism for them. Another very challenging thing here that is getting more and more from a attack standpoint that we're seeing on this is if they can compromise an actual account of one of your vendors, because then it's almost impossible to detect that that's coming again from somebody who is not a known or a related party, because it's coming from their actual email. We'll talk about some of the brief recommendations that you can do here, but internal controls are huge on this, specifically around wiring or any payment changes. There needs to be, again, we'll go down to the bottom of this bullet right here, but don't make any payment changes without verifying that change with the intended recipient. I would say the best practice is to pick up the phone and call them. That's what we normally see on this, that there's a phone check on this, that you don't make any changes just based on an email. But again, unfortunately, this is continuing to be a very effective method of attack still here in 2024 into 2025.
Hey, Tyler, before we move on to the next slide, we did get a question in the chat. What's the most common way that ransomware gets on computers? Phishing emails? And I would say, yeah, I mean, that's one of the biggest ones. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, that is still one of the most effective methods. If somebody clicks on a link and then once it's deployed, it becomes really challenging at that standpoint. We'll talk about some of the mitigating controls here coming next that you can do and make sure are in place. But if it does get implemented into the environment, having an alert monitoring system that can identify this from a security tool perspective is huge, because you can potentially shut down as fast as possible and potentially mitigate risk or damage once that malware gets live in the environment. We'll go to that a little bit more, but great question there of how that's getting deployed. Andrew, as we move down here to the next slide, again, if you're acquiring a company, what are some of the questions you need to be asking, and what are some of the areas that you need to be considering if you're acquiring a company here, and where you can kind of get a temperature check on if they do have a firm cybersecurity posture or there's potential gaps here. And then also, if you're on the call and you're wanting to kind of do a quick sniff test of where you kind of stand up on this, these are some really strong considerations that we look at when we're going through the diligence process. And again, depending on the size and the scale of your company, making sure you have something around these considerations in place is huge to potentially respond to some of the incidents that we discussed above and potentially prevent some of those incidents based on these types of controls and that you should have in place. The first one around this is around the governance process. So I won't spend a ton of time on the incident response and business continuity, because Andrea is going to speak directly to that with ransomware and why this is so important. But having a strong information security program, this drives and guides your organization. Again, scale matters here. But having something outlined that's driving that is one of the first pieces that we look at to see, does a company have something like that in place and documented that's guiding them. Andrea mentioned security awareness training. This is huge because, as we mentioned, you can have the best technical controls in place and a strong environment. However, if you don't have your people properly trained, then again, they are a huge risk to the organization for allowing a security incident to occur. So it's just as important to couple that with a strong technical security environment. There's an information sharing and analysis center and other websites like ISAC where you can gain knowledge. Again, we mentioned the IC3. You can see the attacks that you're up against and what threat actors are still leveraging and utilizing to prepare your organization appropriately and to be able to respond if you are unfortunately a victim of one of those attacks. From an application software and infrastructure standpoint, we look at a couple of things here. So is there application whitelisting controls in place? That's just a very fancy way of saying for certain applications that you have deployed in your environment, do you have those limited where people can only go to those apps, or can they potentially remove or go to other apps within your environment? Patching is a huge piece, whether it's Microsoft or non-Microsoft patches, depending on your environment. Make sure your systems are up to date and patched with the most recent patches, and they're on a proper deployment schedule to make sure from a vulnerability management standpoint, you are not exposed. Accurate asset inventories are huge for your hardware and software. You've got to know what your systems are and what your software is to make sure it's up to date. If you don't know what those assets are, those are weaknesses in the environment, and make sure that the data that sits on these systems is classified appropriately as well. Air gapping your backups to keep them out of reach of an attack. Andrea will talk on this a little bit more, but this is huge to make sure these are in place, because again, if you do have malware that gets implemented in your environment, they will try to encrypt an online backup if it can get to it, that you cannot stand back up on. So if you have an offline backup, this is a very effective method depending on how often these are updated, but an offline backup is huge to be able to stand back up on in the event of a ransomware attack. Likewise, make sure those air gap backups are immutable, encrypted, and can't be changed. That's another mitigating control, so that those systems that backup cannot be altered once it is offline. From an IT security perspective, Andrea will touch on the cybersecurity insurance and how that should fit in, but using multi-factor and two-factor authentication where applicable across your systems. Please make sure that you have that deployed where there's also appropriate solutions that you can leverage and utilize on that. Local administrator rights are a thing that we see, unfortunately, to be very still a huge issue as this becomes a major problem for companies when their employees can install software or systems without an IT person or an administrator who only has that right or privilege. That allows for potential malicious software installs. Also, to make sure you have a security and event management tool in place that's able to analyze and aggregate your logs and allow you to respond appropriately. And then lastly, down here at the bottom, make sure there's proper data loss prevention controls that you can put in place, like email tagging based on the type of solution where it can identify the type of data that you have attached to the email or that you have in the body of the email, and encrypt that data so that you're not transmitting data potentially that would have sensitive information in it. And Andrea, with that, we'll move to our third polling question here, which we want to ask. Unfortunately, we may see a lot of answers here on this, but have you experienced a security incident at your company? And again, we're talking about in the history of your company. So yes, one or more. No, for B, never, and I hope to keep it that way. C, I don't believe so, or hopefully D, is not an answer that I just learned about what a security incident is. And Andrea, I know unfortunately we saw this being very prevalent in 2024, and unfortunately we'll probably continue to see this in 2025.
Yeah, it's quite shocking to learn how many of our clients and their target companies have gone through this. But I will tell you that once you experience it, they actively are, working to improve their incident response plans and disaster recovering exercises and investing in the cybersecurity training. I mean, putting those controls in place so it never happens again.
Yep. Yes, one or more.
No, never, and I hope to keep it that way. Lucky 20+%, and I don't believe so. So yeah, we'll jump into the next slide here and just chat through what to do if it happens to you. We hope no one on this call is in this situation and has to reference this slide, but if you do, let's just chat about what to do if you are put in this situation. So we want to talk about this really from two angles here. So if you're faced in a situation, what should you do? And then two, if you're acquiring a company that has experienced this in the past, you'd want to ask some of these questions and think about some of these things and understand how they really have responded. So starting with the incident response plan, we've talked about this a couple times throughout today's call, but if you're in this situation, hopefully you already have this plan in place and it's formalized prior to the incident occurring. But usually it'll contain, the team that's involved, the internal and external teams that are involved. If you're acquiring a company that has experienced an incident, we'd recommend reviewing their incident response plan just to make sure that it's specific to the company and their key systems. And then also, has there been any updates to that policy and plan after an incident has occurred? And then you'd really want to get an understanding of how often that plan's tested. So testing the plan is just as important as having the plan. So we recommend that it's tested as often as quarterly and at the very least annually, so you know what steps to take and who to involve. And just due to the time, I am going to just quickly cover the rest of these here. So verifying backups, ideally these would be readily available for your data and systems to pull from. Contacting law enforcement, reporting the attack to the authorities. So you've heard us mention IC3 throughout this webinar. That would be who you would want to be filing that report with. And then if you have, if you're looking to acquire a company that has experienced a security incident, you'd really want to be able to pull an actual report that was logged with local law enforcement, just to make sure that everything from the incident was logged, it was reported, and that relates to the next part of this, which is engaging the professionals. So the cybersecurity incident, or the cybersecurity experts out there, this is their job to step in, support, document, and help clean up what happened. So you'd really, again, want to look at that documentation and understand if a forensic analysis was performed in the event that this happened to a company that you were looking to acquire. And again, if it happens to you, go to the authorities and get that documented and get that logged with them. And then we've got proof of life. So this really just means asking the threat actors. So if you are experiencing a ransomware attack, it's asking the threat actors for copies of those encrypted files just to make sure that they actually can be decrypted. So this step really just shows that the decryption provided by the attackers will work, and that those files can actually be unlocked for consideration. So from the acquisition lens, again, there's really those cybersecurity experts being involved in having that information documented in that formal report. And then lastly, cybersecurity insurance. So hopefully if you're, again, if you're in this situation, you already have that in place, but it really does help recover quickly. So some of these policies that are out there today have, some of those costs already baked in for data recovery and restoration type processes. They have some recommendations for incident response teams that are tied to the policy, those types of things. And then just from an acquisition perspective here too, if an attack has occurred at a company that you're looking to acquire, you would want to review the policy and see if there were any claims against it, look for potential premium increase depending on the severity of the attack. Tyler, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would just say to your point, Andrea, on all of it is, normally we see the process of engaging your legal teams in this as well, because the classification of what you're calling it, a security incident versus a security breach, are two different terms there, and you want to treat everything as an incident first until you can determine that if there was potential data that was breached that would impact customers downstream. You just want to make sure that you classify it appropriately and that you don't use terms that, again, can create a more negative impact than potential until you evaluated that has actually occurred. So we always say treat it as a security incident first, but then you may have to take the proper steps and protocols from a breach perspective if you do determine based on that forensic analysis that potential data was breached and what types of data. Again, Andrea, to your point, if you're acquired a company in a regulated industry, you need to make sure the proper authorities were notified. There are proper channels that they're supposed to follow on that. And then again, we advise to follow legal's guidance on that as well, and to make sure if you are doing an acquisition that they haven't engaged the legal team, all of these proper steps are being taken. That can give you some comfort around that they did take the proper steps and they've remediated this properly.
I also want to call out too that if you're utilizing reps and warranties insurance on a transaction, these are topics that are always coming up during RWI calls. So if you experience an incident, how have you responded in these respective areas that are on the slide? So again, we hope you never have to reference this slide in the future, but if you do find yourself in a situation where your company has been impacted by these types of incidents, we hope that these tips and questions are helpful when the time does come. And then I do want to just quickly touch on investing in cyber and IT projects. So scariest part's over on the ransomware and security incidents, and we'll move into another fun topic of tech debt. So what exactly is tech debt? So it's the cost of choosing quick and easy solutions over long-term solutions. So we've included a few different examples of tech debt that we often see at companies, and just want to highlight for you guys. So messy code is not developed, reviewed, or properly tested in order to quickly deploy it into production. So we often see this with like a custom ERP system. They're trying to get something out, messy code's deployed, and then refactoring of that code has to take place later on. We've also seen very often delaying a hardware refresh cycle. So typically a refresh cycle is every 3 to 5 years for IT assets. And oftentimes we'll see that companies will delay it if the asset seems to be working just fine, or if maybe the IT budget doesn't allow for it. And again, that just adds to technical debt. Unpatched vulnerabilities, Tyler covered it above, and if patches aren't rolled out regularly to endpoints, that increases risk, right? So security risks. And then I'll touch on it again because this is just a message that we want to make sure everybody responds to. Is on the cybersecurity awareness training. So again, that's another item that we see getting cut from a budget, but we talked about the use case and the importance of it. It really does matter. Your people definitely matter, and it's a highly important information that we'd like to relay. And then lastly, redundant systems. So we've seen situations where there's multiple ERPs running side by side, multiple CRM systems. That would, again, increase technical debt on that front. So really being able to identify current tech debt that you have in your IT environment, measuring it, and then managing that current technical debt is something that you can really do today to help prepare for sale. So, companies that really focus on remediating these types of tech debt items are really more attractive when it comes to sale time, and historically have had higher valuation than companies that need a significant amount of investment in their IT platforms to true that up. So with that, Tyler is going to talk us through some additional considerations for investing in IT and cyber.
Yep, thanks, Andrea, and we'll move fast. I know we're up against the hour on this, but just a couple of things to point out here. We do know that companies that are implementing and investing in these projects ultimately are going to strengthen their competitive position here. That if they're managing tech debt effectively, they're better positioned to be able to adapt to market changers, deliver a better customer experience, remain competitive, and attract future buyers, as Andrea mentioned. Again, not to beat a dead horse here, but to enhance your operation efficiency is huge here. Reducing that technical debt ultimately minimizes your system inefficiencies and the maintenance burdens that are required across multiple systems. which ultimately going to ultimately going to turn into your teams being able to focus on value-added services and not spending a significant amount of time again on services and maintenance burdens because of the technical debt here. We do know that happy employees are long-term employees, so well-maintained IT environments reduce these frustrations among teams, ultimately leading to higher retention rates. And again, as technical debt continues to reduce, you can reallocate that time and allow companies to prioritize the business initiatives. And again, that's just going to allow your leadership teams to have access to this additional information to make more informed decisions as you measure those resources. With that, we'll move into the next slide here that we did want to call out specifically around your post-close offerings or post-close considerations. So we talked through what potential IT and cyber projects you should think about or considering. Again, if you're looking at companies, making sure, as you transition into the post-close period, you prioritize these types of investments. We go with a risk-based approach on this from a first 90 days and over the whole investment life cycle of how those should be thought about. But as you can see, there's multiple different types of offerings here. We work very closely with our value creation team to, depending on, from an acquisition standpoint, the considerations that need to be taken to potentially get the most out of the business and what needs to be handled first on that. Push this next slide. And again, you'll just see different types of services. So as you think about that post-close period and that over the investment life cycle, make sure prioritizing those considerations that come out of, again, your diligence, but also make sure from the cybersecurity considerations and the AI considerations that we mentioned earlier, that you do think about those and that you prioritize those as well, depending on, again, what's being in use with those companies. And as you prepare for sale, these are good areas to make sure that you're handling to put your company in the best position from a cybersecurity posture moving forward. And with that, I think Gail can transition to the last question here. I know we're up against the hour.
Yeah, and Tyler, we did get one other question in the chat. At what point do these breaches result in a material weakness in internal control? I'd like to answer that one before we head out here.
Yeah, just to see that. I can tell you, depending on, again, what industry you're in, if you're in a public company, you have to disclose any type of cybersecurity incident that occurs. With that, what we look at from an internal control perspective is the impact of that, and has a company gone through and evaluated that appropriately to determine why it is or is not a material impact. We haven't seen a ton that have implemented or had a material weakness because of this, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. And at what point do these become? It's going to be individual for each type of breach that occurs, and based on that industry, the significant amount of, if there's a potential payout that could be material, but again, that has to be individually evaluated.
All right. Well, we did leave our contact information for those that do have any questions, concerns, or would like some additional material on anything that we chatted about today. We're happy to provide that, but really want to thank everyone for joining. And with that, I believe we've got one more video ahead.